world was a symphony of chaos, and Lieutenant Commander Eva Rostova was its unwilling conductor. From her cramped position inside the battered MRAP, the rhythmic thud of heavy machine gun fire provided a brutal backbeat to the staccato cracks of small arms. The vehicle, once a symbol of American military might, was now a metal coffin, its armored hide pockmarked and scarred. Outside, the Afghan village of Al-Qadim was a blur of dust, smoke, and the fleeting shadows of men who wanted them dead. Havoc 1, this is Trident 3. We are taking effective fire from all sides. We are pinned down at Checkpoint Charlie. How copy? The voice of Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thorne, the SEAL team's leader, was strained, each word punctuated by the roar of his own weapon. Ava, her fingers dancing across the encrypted communications console, felt a familiar knot of frustration tighten in her stomach. Trident 3, this is Havoc 1, she replied, her voice a stark contrast to the panic simmering around her. I have you, solid. Air support is still 10 minutes out. The sandstorm is playing hell with their ET. 10 minutes? Thorne's voice was incredulous. We don't have 10 seconds. A fresh wave of impact slammed into the MRAP, and the vehicle lurched violently. One of the younger SEALs, a kid named Miller, let out a pained grunt as his helmeted head bounced off the interior wall. He was a good operator, they all were, but they were caught in a well-sprung trap, and the professional calm they all prided themselves on was beginning to fray at the edges. Ava, however, remained a picture of serene focus. To the SEALs, she was a bit of an enigma. She wasn't one of them, not really. She was a communications specialist, a Sparky, attached to their team for this specific mission, due to her expertise in a new piece of experimental gear. She was quiet, almost unnervingly so, and while she was undeniably competent at her job, there was an air of detachment about her, a sense that she was observing their world rather than truly being a part of it. Just keep their heads down, Senior Chief, she said, her tone as placid as a mountain lake. I'm working on a solution. A solution? Thorne's laughter was harsh and humorless. Lieutenant, with all due respect, unless you can pull a rabbit out of that high-tech hat of yours, we're about to become a permanent addition to the local landscape. He didn't mean it to be cruel, but the word still stung. Underdog. It was a role she'd grown accustomed to, a carefully constructed camouflage she wore as comfortably as her uniform. She was a woman in a man's world, a technical specialist in a world of warriors. They saw her as a support asset, a necessary but ultimately peripheral piece of the puzzle. They had no idea what she was truly capable of, and that was by design. Working, she repeated, her eyes scanning the digital topography map on her screen. The village was a complex maze of mud brick compounds and narrow alleyways, a textbook ambush site. The enemy was well entrenched, their positions carefully chosen to provide overlapping fields of fire. They were disciplined, and their commander, a shadowy figure known only as the Mullah, was rumored to be a former Afghan army officer with a knack for tactical planning. They're not just shooting, Lieutenant, another SEAL, a grizzled veteran named Gator, chimed in. They're maneuvering. They're trying to flank us. He was right. Eva could see the enemy icons on her display, small red diamonds that moved with a chilling purpose. They were closing in, a tightening noose. The SEALs were outnumbered, outgunned, and their time was running out. Eva took a deep breath, the recycled air of the MRAP tasting stale and metallic. She could feel their eyes on her, a mixture of desperation and doubt. They were waiting for a miracle, for the cavalry to come charging over the hill, but the cavalry was still miles away, lost in a sea of sand and sky. The miracle, she knew, would have to be her. The MRAP's interior was a pressure cooker of controlled fear. The air, thick with the smell of cordite and sweat, was a tangible entity, pressing in on them from all sides. The rhythmic barrage of enemy fire had become a constant, a hellish drumbeat that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. Status on that air support, Havoc 1. Thorne's voice, though still tight, had regained some of its professional edge. He was a leader, and leaders didn't have the luxury of panic. No change, Trident 3, Ava replied, her gaze never leaving the shimmering pixels of her console. They're pushing, but the storm's a real beast. It's like flying through a brick wall. Damn it! Thorne slammed a gloved fist against the MRAP's bulkhead, the metallic clang barely audible over the din of battle. He turned to his men, his face a grim mask. All right, listen up. We're not dying in this tin can. We're going to have to break out. Miller, you and Gator on the right. Johnson, you're with me on the left. We lay down a base of fire and we move, compound to compound. We make for the old mosque on the east side of the village. It's our only viable fallback position. It was a desperate plan, a textbook response to a textbook ambush. But they were SEALs, the best of the best. Desperate was their stock in trade. As the men began to prepare, checking their weapons and ammunition, Eva felt a subtle shift in the rhythm of the enemy's fire. It was almost imperceptible, a slight change in the cadence of the machine guns, a new urgency in the crackle of the small arms. It was a language she understood intimately, the language of combat, and what it was telling her sent a shiver of ice down her spine. "Senior Chief," she said, her voice cutting through the preparations. "Hold on a minute." Thorne turned to her, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Lieutenant, we don't have a minute. The enemy's fire patterns are changing," she explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up a new set of data streams. "They're not just trying to flank us anymore. They're consolidating their fire on our position. They're getting ready for a final assault." "And how exactly do you know that?" Gator asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "The experimental gear I'm using," she said, tapping the side of her console, "Project Cerberus. It's a next-generation signals intelligence suite. It doesn't just intercept enemy comms, it analyzes them in real time. It can identify individual weapon signatures, track firing rates, even extrapolate tactical intent based on a whole host of variables." The SEALs exchanged glances. They'd been briefed on Project Cerberus, of course, but the technical jargon had gone in one ear and out the other. To them it was just another black box, another piece of high-tech wizardry that was supposed to give them an edge. "So what's it telling you, Lieutenant?" Thorne asked. His interest piqued despite himself. "It's telling me," she said, her eyes narrowing as she pointed to a specific point on the digital map, "that the enemy commander, the mullah, is right there. In that two-story building, on the second floor, in the northeast corner." A heavy silence fell over the MRAP's interior, broken only by the continuing roar of the battle outside. The SEALs stared at the map, at the small pulsating red icon that marked the mullah's supposed location. It was over 800 meters away, well beyond the effective range of their standard-issue rifles, and with no clear line of sight. "That's impossible," Miller said, shaking his head. "There's no way you can know that." "The Cerberus system is cross-referencing multiple data points," Eva explained patiently. "It's picking up a concentration of encrypted radio signals originating from that location, all directed at the enemy units in the field. It's also detecting a unique electronic signature, a specific model of satellite phone that we've previously associated with high-level insurgent leaders." "So he's on the phone, calling in the plays," Gator grumbled. "That still doesn't help us. We can't get to him. And that's not all," Eva continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The system has also isolated a faint audio signature from that room. It's the mullah's voice. It's running a real-time analysis against a voice print we have on file for him." She paused, letting the full weight of her words sink in. "It's a 98% match." The SEALs were stunned into silence. This went far beyond simple signals intelligence. This was something else entirely, something that bordered on clairvoyance. "So what you're saying," Thorne said slowly, his eyes locked on Eva's, "is that you know exactly where the head of the snake is?" "Yes," she replied, her expression unreadable. "I do." "But it doesn't matter," Miller said, his voice laced with frustration. "We can't get a shot from here. We're blind." "Not necessarily," Eva said, a strange, almost predatory light glinting in her eyes. "There's a storm drain that runs from here to the base of that building. It's not on any of the standard maps, but it's showing up on the Suros ground-penetrating radar." She zoomed in on the map, and a faint blue line appeared, a hidden pathway through the chaos. "It's a long shot," she admitted, "but it's a shot." Thorne stared at her, a dawning sense of awe on his face. This quiet, unassuming communications specialist had just given them a lifeline, a sliver of hope in a seemingly hopeless situation. She wasn't just a Sparky. She was something more. He just didn't know what, yet. The decision was made in a heartbeat. The SEALs, trained to adapt and overcome, to seize any advantage no matter how slim, recognized the opportunity for what it was. a high-risk, high-reward gamble that could turn the tide of the entire battle. "All right," Thorne said, his voice a low, urgent growl. "Here's the plan. Gator, you and Miller lay down a continuous, suppressive fire on the enemy's frontline positions. I want you to make them think we're preparing for a full frontal assault. Johnson, you're with me. We're going to provide close-in security for the lieutenant. We're going to get her to that storm drain, and we're going to make sure she has the time she needs to do her thing." "And what thing is that exactly?" Gator asked, still trying to wrap his head around the sudden shift in their fortunes. "She's going to take out the mullah," Thorne said, his gaze fixed on Ava, "from 800 meters away, through a storm drain." He said it with a conviction that surprised even himself. There was something about the lieutenant's calm, her unwavering confidence, that was infectious. It was the kind of quiet professionalism that he, as a seasoned operator, recognized and respected. "You're going to need a spotter," Johnson said, already pulling a specialized scope from his pack. "I won't," Ava said, her voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "The Cerberus system will provide me with all the targeting data I need. Wind speed, elevation, even the Coriolis effect. It's all calculated in real time." The SEALs exchanged another round of incredulous looks. They were used to working in pairs, a shooter and a spotter, a finely tuned machine built on trust and communication. The idea of a single operator, guided by a computer, making a shot of that magnitude was almost sacrilegious. But there was no time to argue. The enemy's fire was intensifying, the bullets impacting against the MRAP's hull with a renewed ferocity. They were running out of time. "All right, let's move," Thorne barked, and the MRAP's rear ramp hissed open, revealing a world of swirling dust and deadly chaos. The moment they stepped out of the vehicle, they were met with a wall of sound and fury. The air was alive with the angry buzz of bullets, the ground trembling with the impact of explosions. It was like stepping into a hornet's nest, and they were the intruders. Gator and Miller immediately went to work, their rifles roaring to life, spitting a torrent of hot lead at the enemy positions. Their fire was precise, controlled, a testament to their years of training. They were buying time, precious seconds that could mean the difference between life and death. Thorne and Johnson formed a protective cocoon around Eva, their bodies acting as a human shield as they moved towards the storm drain. Eva, for her part, seemed almost oblivious to the danger. She moved with a fluid grace, her movements economical and purposeful. She wasn't a warrior, not in the traditional sense, but she was a survivor, and that was a skill that transcended any specific job title. The storm drain was located at the edge of the small compound where they had been pinned down. It was a dark, uninviting maw, a gaping wound in the earth that smelled of damp and decay. It was their only hope. "Go!" Thorne yelled over the din of battle, pushing Eva towards the opening. "We'll hold them off as long as we can!" Eva didn't hesitate. She slid into the darkness, the rough concrete scraping against her uniform. The storm drain was narrow, claustrophobic, the air thick with a stench of stagnant water, but it was also a sanctuary, a temporary reprieve from the storm of steel raging above. She crawled forward, her movements slow and deliberate, the Cerberus console clutched in her hands. The digital map on its screen was her only guide, a glowing beacon in the oppressive darkness. As she moved deeper into the earth, the sounds of battle began to fade, replaced by the gentle drip of water and the thumping of her own heart. She was alone now, truly alone, a ghost in the machine, and she was about to do what ghosts do best. She was about to haunt the man who thought he was untouchable. The storm drain was a tight, constricting tube of concrete and darkness. Eva moved through it with a practiced, almost unnerving ease, her body contorting to fit the narrow confines. The air was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the searing heat of the battle she had left behind. Above her, the muffled thumps of explosions and the distant rattle of gunfire were a constant reminder of the stakes. Her world had been reduced to the glowing screen of the Cerberus console. It was her eyes, her ears, her guide through this subterranean maze. The blue line that represented the storm drain pulsed with a steady, reassuring light, leading her towards her objective. A small red icon, the mullah, blinked with a malevolent rhythm, a digital heartbeat that she was determined to stop. She crawled for what felt like an eternity, the rough concrete abrading the skin on her knees and elbows, but she felt no pain, only a cold, detached focus. This was her element, the place where she thrived. She was a creature of the shadows, a whisper in the static, and she was in her element. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the blue line on her screen ended. She had reached the base of the building where the mullah was located. She slowed her movements, her breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts. She was a predator, closing in on her prey. She found a small vertical shaft leading upwards, a maintenance access point that was barely wide enough for her to squeeze through. It was a tight fit, her shoulders scraping against the grimy walls, but she moved with a lithe, almost inhuman grace. She was a spider climbing its web, and the mullah was the fly. The shaft opened up into a small, dark space, a crawl space between the first and second floors. The air here was thick with the smell of dust and old wood. Through a small crack in the floorboards above, she could hear the faint murmur of voices. They were speaking in Pashto, their tones urgent and excited. She carefully positioned the Cerberus console, its sensitive microphones filtering and amplifying the sounds from above. The system's translation software went to work, and the Pashto words were instantly converted into English text on her screen. "The Americans are trapped," one voice said, a triumphant lilt in his tone. "They are like rats in a cage." "The mullah's plan was perfect," another voice chimed in. They walked right into it. "He is on the satellite phone with the council now," the first voice continued. "He is telling them of our great victory." Ava's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. They were celebrating a victory that had not yet been won. They were blind to the danger that lurked just a few feet beneath them. She unslung the weapon she had been carrying on her back. It was not a standard-issue M4 carbine or a specialized SEAL sniper rifle. It was something else entirely. A weapon that none of the SEALs would have recognized. It was a custom-built, integrally suppressed rifle, its design sleek and minimalist. It was a ghost's weapon, designed for a single, silent purpose. She attached a small, specialized scope to the rifle, a scope that was wirelessly linked to the Cerberus console. The image on the console's screen flickered, and then stabilized, showing her a real-time feed from the scope. She now had a god's-eye view of the room above. The view was grainy, distorted by the narrow crack in the floorboards, but it was enough. She could see the mullah, a large, bearded man with a cruel, intelligent face. He was pacing back and forth, a satellite phone pressed to his ear, a triumphant smile on his lips. He was a dead man walking. Eva's movements were a study in economy and precision. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Every action was deliberate, honed by years of training that the SEALs she was with couldn't even begin to comprehend. She was a surgeon preparing for a delicate life-or-math operation. She gently inserted the barrel of her rifle into the crack in the floorboards, the specialized suppressor ensuring that her movements were completely silent. The weapon was an extension of her own body, a familiar and comforting weight in her hands. The image on the Cerberus console sharpened, the system's advanced optics compensating for the poor visibility. The mullah's face was now in sharp focus, his every expression, every nuance laid bare for her to see. He was arrogant, confident, a man who believed he was in complete control of his own destiny. He was wrong. The Cerberus system was feeding her a constant stream of data, a torrent of information that would have overwhelmed a lesser operator. The distance to the target, 817 meters. The wind speed and direction, calculated from a network of micro-drones she had deployed earlier. The humidity, the barometric pressure, even the subtle gravitational pull of the Earth. It was all factored into the firing solution, a complex equation that the system solved in a fraction of a second. A small green dot appeared on the screen, hovering over the mullah's left eye. It was the projected point of impact, the precise spot where her bullet would strike. It was a promise of death, delivered with the cold, impersonal certainty of a mathematical formula. She took a slow, deep breath, her heart rate dropping to a steady, rhythmic beat. The world outside, the chaos of the battle, the desperate struggle of the SEALs, it all faded away. There was only her, the rifle, and the man on the screen. Her finger tightened on the trigger, the movement so subtle, so controlled, that it was almost imperceptible. There was no flinch, no anticipation, just a smooth, clean break. The rifle coughed, a soft, almost apologetic sound that was swallowed by the darkness of the crawl space. There was no muzzle flash, No telltale crack of a supersonic bullet, just a faint, almost inaudible hiss as the projectile left the barrel. On the screen, the mullah's head snapped back, a small dark hole appearing exactly where the green dot had been. The satellite phone slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. His eyes, a moment before filled with triumph, were now vacant, lifeless pools. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, a silent testament to the invisible hand that had struck him down. For a moment, there was a stunned silence in the room above. The mullah's two bodyguards stared at his fallen form, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. They had heard nothing, seen nothing. It was as if their leader had been struck down by an act of God. And then, the panic set in. They began to shout, their voices filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. The carefully orchestrated ambush had suddenly, inexplicably, fallen apart. Eva watched them for a few more moments, her expression unreadable. Her work here was done. She had decapitated the snake, and the body would now wither and die. She slowly, silently, withdrew her rifle from the crack in the floorboards. She disassembled it with the same quiet efficiency with which she had fired it, stowing it away in her pack. She was a ghost, and it was time to disappear. And her pack, it was time to disappear. She began to make her way back through the crawlspace, back to the storm drain, back to the world of the living. She had done her job, and she had done it with a skill and a precision that was almost supernatural. But the true test was yet to come. The SEALs, the men who had doubted her, who had seen her as nothing more than a support asset, were about to come face to face with the consequences of her actions. And their world, their understanding of what was possible, was about to be turned upside down. The return journey through the storm drain was a mirror image of her approach. Silent, methodical, and utterly devoid of emotion. Eva moved with the unhurried pace of a professional who has completed her task and is now simply tidying up. The muffled sounds of the battle above had changed. The furious, sustained roar of enemy fire had been replaced by sporadic, disorganized bursts. The hornet's nest had been kicked, but the queen was dead, and the swarm was now in disarray. As she neared the exit, the sounds of American weapons grew louder, more confident. The SEALs were no longer just surviving, they were dominating. She could hear Thorne's voice, clear and commanding, directing his men with renewed vigor. The pressure was off. Eva emerged from the storm drain's mouth, blinking against the harsh afternoon light. She was covered in grime and smelled of damp earth, but she was otherwise untouched. Thorne, Johnson, and Miller were crouched behind the low wall of the compound, their weapons still trained on the village. Bader was on the radio, his voice calm and steady. Havoc 1, this is Trident 3. Enemy fire has slackened considerably. We're beginning to maneuver. What's the status on that air support? Eva walked calmly towards them, her footfalls making soft sounds in the dust. Thorne turned, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. He had been so focused on the fight that he hadn't seen her return. "Lieutenant," he said, a note of genuine astonishment in his voice. "You're back." "I am," she replied, her tone as placid as ever. She began to clean her hands with a small cloth from her pack, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "What happened?" Johnson asked, his gaze flicking between Eva and the now quiet village. Did you do it?" "The mullah is no longer a factor," Eva said simply. She offered no further explanation, no dramatic retelling of her silent, deadly work. The statement was delivered with the same flat, factual tone she would use to report a change in radio frequencies. For a moment, the SEALs just stared at her. They were warriors, men who dealt in the brutal, visceral reality of combat. They were used to firefights, explosions, the tangible evidence of a kill. The idea that a single, silent shot, fired from a hidden position nearly a kilometer away, could so completely and utterly change the course of a battle was difficult to process. "How?" Miller finally managed to ask, his voice a half-whisper of awe. "We didn't hear a thing." "You weren't meant to," Eva said. She finished cleaning her hands and looked up at them, her gaze cool and appraising. "The situation is under control. Air support should be here shortly. I suggest we secure a perimeter and wait for them." Thorne, a man who had seen more combat than most soldiers see in a lifetime, was at a loss for words. He had been so certain that they were dead men, that their only hope was a desperate bloody breakout, and then this quiet, unassuming woman, This Sparky, who he had dismissed as a non-combatant, had single-handedly saved them all. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the calm, steady eyes, the utter lack of fear, the almost preternatural confidence. He saw a professional, a warrior of a different kind, a woman who operated on a level he couldn't even begin to fathom. And he realized with a sudden, chilling certainty that he had been in the presence of something truly extraordinary. He didn't know what she was or where she had come from, but he knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the ground beneath his feet, that she was no ordinary communications specialist. She was something else entirely, and he was beginning to suspect that he was very, very glad she was on his side. The arrival of the helicopters was an anticlimax. Two sleek black HH-60 Pavehawks, their rotors beating a thunderous rhythm against the sand-choked air, descended upon the village like avenging angels. They landed in a swirl of dust and debris, their miniguns spitting a final, defiant burst of fire at the now silent enemy positions. The SEALs, their faces grimy and streaked with sweat, watched them land with a sense of weary relief. They had survived, against all odds, and for that they were grateful. But their relief was tinged with a new, unsettling emotion, a sense of profound and utter bewilderment. They had spent the last 10 minutes securing the compound, their movements crisp and professional, but their minds were a whirl of questions. They had all, at one point or another, glanced over at Lieutenant Rostova, who was calmly disassembling her communications gear, her expression as placid and unreadable as ever. She was a puzzle they couldn't solve, a question they didn't even know how to ask. As the Pavehawks touched down, a figure emerged from the lead helicopter, ducking under the still-spinning rotors. He was a tall, imposing man in a crisp, clean uniform, his rank insignia glinting in the harsh sunlight. He was a colonel, and he moved with the easy, confident authority of a man who was used to being in charge. He strode towards them, his face a grim, unsmiling mask. "Senior Chief Thorne?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "Yes, sir," Thorne replied, snapping to attention. The other SEALs followed suit, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the presence of a superior officer. The colonel's eyes swept over them, taking in their battered appearances, the pockmarked walls of the compound, the lingering smell of cordite in the air. His gaze was sharp, appraising, and it missed nothing. "I'm Colonel Matthews," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I was in the command and control bird monitoring your situation. You and your men did a hell of a job down here, Senior Chief. A hell of a job." "Thank you, sir," Thorne said, a flicker of pride cutting through his weariness. "But the credit doesn't belong to us." He gestured towards Eva, who was still kneeling by her equipment, seemingly oblivious to the colonel's arrival. "Lieutenant Rostova, sir. She's the one who turned the tide." Colonel Matthews's gaze shifted to Eva, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. It was a strange expression, a mixture of surprise, recognition, and something else, something that looked almost like awe. He took a step towards her, his movements slow and deliberate. The SEALs watched, their curiosity piqued. There was a story here, a story they were only just beginning to understand. "Lieutenant Rostova," the colonel said, his voice now a quiet, respectful murmur, "I should have known." Eva looked up, her calm, steady gaze meeting his. She said nothing, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a slight, almost imperceptible straightening of her shoulders. It was a sign of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that she was no longer in the presence of strangers. The colonel's eyes, however, weren't on her face. They were on her hand, on the small, unassuming object she had just finished packing away. It was a challenge coin, a common tradition in the military, a small metal disc that signified membership in a particular unit or a specific deployment. But this was no ordinary challenge coin. It was made of a strange, dark metal, a metal that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. And on its surface, etched with a skill that was almost preternatural, was a single, stark image, a three-headed dog, its eyes burning with a cold, ethereal fire. Cerberus, the name of her experimental gear, and the SEALs now realized the name of something much, much more. Colonel Matthews stood frozen, his eyes locked on the challenge coin in Eva's hand. The raucous noise of the helicopter rotors, the chatter of the arriving support troops, the very air itself seemed to fade into a muted background hum. For a long, silent moment, the only thing that existed in his world was that small, dark disk and the woman who held it. The SEALs watched the silent exchange, their confusion mounting. They were all familiar with challenge coins. They were a part of military culture, a symbol of camaraderie and shared experience. They carried their own coins, each one a testament to the teams they had served with, the operations they had survived. But this coin, and the colonel's reaction to it, was something entirely different. The insignia of the three-headed dog was stark and menacing. It wasn't the proud, soaring eagle of the Navy or the crossed trident of the SEALs. It was something else, something darker, more ancient. It was a symbol of a guardian, a gatekeeper, a sentinel who stood watch over the boundary between worlds. Finally, the colonel seemed to find his voice, though it was little more than a choked whisper. I haven't seen one of those in a very long time," he said, his gaze still fixed on the coin. I thought you were all gone." Ava slowly closed her hand around the coin, the dark metal disappearing into her palm. She rose to her feet, her movements fluid and graceful, and looked the colonel directly in the eye. "Reports of our demise," she said, her voice a low, quiet murmur, "have been greatly exaggerated." The colonel let out a long, slow breath, a sound that was equal parts relief and disbelief. He ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, his carefully composed military bearing momentarily forgotten. "The shot," he said, his voice filled with a dawning understanding. "The single shot that took out the mullah. It was you." "It was," she confirmed, her tone as factual and unemotional as ever. "But how?" Thorne blurted out, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "The mullah was over 800 meters away, in a fortified building with no line of sight. It's an impossible shot." Colonel Matthews turned to Thorne, a strange, almost pitying look on his face. "For you, Senior Chief, yes," he said. "For most soldiers it would be impossible, but not for her." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the stunned SEALs. "You men are the tip of the spear," he said, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "You're the best of the best. But there are levels of best that you can't even begin to imagine. There are operators who exist in the shadows, who take on missions that are so secret, so sensitive, that they don't even have a name." He turned back to Eva, his voice dropping to a near-reverent whisper. "They are the ghosts in the machine," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "The ones who do the impossible, the ones who win the wars that are never fought in the headlines. They are Project Chimera." The name hung in the air, heavy and portentous. It was a name none of the SEALs had ever heard before, a name that spoke of myth and legend, of things that were not meant to be known. And in that moment, everything became clear. The quiet, unassuming communications specialist, the Sparky who had seemed so out of place among them, was not what she appeared to be. She was a member of a unit so secret, so elite, that their very existence was a rumor, a whisper in the darkest corners of the intelligence community. She was one of the ghosts, and they had just seen her work. The revelation hung in the dusty air of the Afghan village, thick and palpable. Project Chimera, the ghosts. The words, once spoken, seemed to take on a life of their own, echoing in the minds of the SEALs. They were men who had dedicated their lives to becoming the most elite fighting force in the world, and they had just been told that there was another level, a level they had never even known existed. They looked at Eva, at this quiet, unassuming woman who had just been unmasked as a living legend, and they saw her in a whole new light. The detached calm, the unnerving focus, the almost supernatural skill, it all made sense now. She wasn't just a good operator, she was something more, something transcendent. Thorne, the hardened veteran, the man who had seen it all, was the first to break the stunned silence. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched, not in a challenge, but in a gesture of profound and utter respect. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. It was a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a healthy dose of professional humility. We owe you our lives. I misjudged you, and for that I am truly sorry." Her smile and The other SEALs murmured their agreement, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and admiration. They had been so quick to dismiss her, to see her as a liability rather than an asset, and they had been so wrong. Ava looked at Thorne's outstretched hand, and for the first time a flicker of something warm and human touched her eyes. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played at the corners of her lips. She took his hand, her grip firm and steady. "You're a good leader, Senior Chief," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You kept your men alive. That's all that matters." She released his hand and turned to Colonel Matthews. "Sir," she said, her tone shifting back to the formal professional cadence of a soldier addressing a superior officer. "I need to file my after-action report, and then I have a new assignment." The colonel nodded, his expression a mixture of awe and regret. He knew that he was in the presence of a true warrior, a woman who had dedicated her life to a cause that was so secret, so vital, that he could only guess at its true scope. "Of course," he said, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "Anything you need, anything at all." As Eva walked towards the waiting Pavehawk, the SEALs watched her go, their faces a mixture of wonder and disbelief. They had just been given a glimpse into a world they had never known existed, a world of shadows and secrets, of ghosts and legends, and they had been saved by one of them. They would never forget her. They would never forget the quiet Sparky who had single-handedly turned the tide of a battle that was all but lost. They would never forget the single, impossible shot that had taken out the enemy commander and saved their lives. And they would never, ever look at a challenge coin the same way again. The flight back to Bagram airfield was a subdued affair. The roar of the Pavehawk's engines filled the cramped cabin, a constant droning presence that seemed to amplify the silence among the men. The SEALs, normally a boisterous, confident group, were lost in their own thoughts, each one replaying the events of the day, trying to make sense of the impossible. Eva sat apart from them, her gaze fixed on the rugged Afghan landscape rushing by below. She was once again the quiet, detached observer, the enigma who had briefly, terrifyingly, shown them her true face. The challenge coin was tucked away, her custom rifle disassembled and hidden, her true identity once again shrouded in secrecy. To any casual observer, she was just another soldier, another face in the endless procession of men and women who fought America's wars. But the SEALs knew better. They knew that they were in the presence of something extraordinary, something that defied their understanding of the world. They were like men who had spent their entire lives studying the ocean, only to be suddenly, unexpectedly, confronted by a living, breathing leviathan from the deep. Thorne in particular was struggling to process the revelation. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to read people, to assess their strengths and weaknesses, to know who he could count on in a firefight. And he had been so completely, utterly wrong about Eva. He had seen a Sparky, a technical specialist, a woman who was out of her element. He had not seen the ghost in the machine, the silent, deadly predator who had saved them all. He looked over at her calm, serene profile, and a question burned in his mind, a question he knew he had to ask. He unbuckled his harness and made his way over to her, swaying with the motion of the helicopter. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. She turned to him, her gaze cool and appraising. "Senior Chief," she replied, her tone neutral. "I have to ask," he said, his voice tight with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. "Project Chimera. What is it? What do you do?" Ava looked at him for a long, silent moment, and he had the distinct impression that she was weighing him, judging him, deciding whether or not he was worthy of an answer. Finally, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We are a contingency," she said, her voice a low, quiet murmur. "A last resort. When all other options have failed, when the situation is deemed impossible, when the stakes are at their highest, they send for us." "They?" Thorne asked, his voice a half-whisper. "The people you don't know exist," she replied, her gaze distant, as if she was looking at something far beyond the confines of the helicopter. "The ones who make the decisions that shape the world." She turned back to him, her eyes locking with his. "We are the scalpel in the dark," she said, her voice filled with a cold, hard certainty. "The ones who cut out the cancer before it has a chance to spread. We do the things that no one else can or will do, and we do them in secret, without recognition, without reward, because the only reward that matters is the one that no one will ever know we have earned." the continued existence of a world that is safe from the things that lurk in the shadows. Thorne was stunned into silence. He had dedicated his life to serving his country, to fighting its enemies, to protecting its ideals. But he had always done so in the light, as a member of a proud and storied tradition. He had never even considered the possibility of a war that was fought in the dark, a war that was so secret, so vital, that its soldiers were ghosts, their victories uncelebrated, their sacrifices unknown. He looked at Eva, at this quiet, unassuming woman who was one of those ghosts, and he felt a sense of awe that was so profound, so overwhelming, that it almost brought him to his knees. He was in the presence of a true hero, a hero whose name would never be written in the history books, whose deeds would never be sung in the halls of power. And he was humbled. The debriefing room at Bagram was a sterile, windowless box, the air chilled by the hum of the air conditioning. It was a place designed for the cold, hard facts of war, a place where emotions were checked at the door. Colonel Matthews sat at the head of a long, polished table, his hands clasped in front of him. On either side of him sat a collection of high-ranking officers, their faces grim and serious. They were the men who moved the pieces on the grand chessboard of the war in Afghanistan, and they were all, to a man, focused on the quiet, unassuming woman who sat at the opposite end of the table. Eva recounted the events of the day with a calm, clinical precision. She spoke of the ambush, the trapped SEAL team, the changing enemy tactics. She described her use of the Cerberus system, the identification of the mullah's location, the single, perfect shot that had ended the threat. She delivered her report with the detached air of a scientist describing an experiment, her voice never wavering, her expression never changing. The officers listened in stunned silence, their pens lying untouched on their notepads. They were men who were used to reports of firefights and ambushes, of victories and defeats. But they had never heard a story like this before. It was a story that belonged in the realm of fiction, of myth and legend. When she was finished, a long, heavy silence fell over the room. The officers exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. Finally, a grizzled one-star general with a chest full of medals cleared his throat. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "I've been in this man's army for 35 years. I've seen things that would make a civilian's hair turn white, but I have never in all my years heard of anything like this. A single operator, with a new piece of experimental gear, taking out a high-value target from half a mile away with no line of sight in the middle of a sandstorm. It's beyond belief." "With all due respect, General," Eva replied, her tone polite but firm, "it is not a matter of belief. It is a matter of capability, and Project Chimera is very, very capable." The general leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I'll say," he chuckled, a sound that seemed to break the tension in the room, "I'll be damned if I know what you are, Lieutenant, but I'm glad you're on our side." The other officers murmured their agreement, a sense of relief and admiration washing over them. They didn't understand what they had just heard, not really, but they understood one thing. They had a weapon in their arsenal that was more powerful, more effective than anything they had ever imagined. As the meeting broke up, Colonel Matthews approached Eva, a look of profound respect on his face. "You and your people," he said, his voice a low, confidential murmur. "You're a legend. A ghost story that we tell the new guys to scare them straight. I never thought I'd meet one of you in the flesh." Eva gave him a small, enigmatic smile. "We're not ghosts, Colonel," she said, her voice soft but clear. "We're just quiet professionals." She turned and walked towards the door, her footsteps making no sound on the polished floor. The officers watched her go, their faces a mixture of awe and wonder. They had just been given a glimpse into a world they had never known existed, a world of shadows and secrets, of impossible missions and legendary warriors. And they knew, with a certainty that was as deep and as unshakable as the mountains of Afghanistan, that they would never forget the quiet Sparky, who had shown them what it truly meant to be a ghost in the machine. The sun was beginning to set over Bagram airfield, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. The air was cooling, the relentless heat of the day giving way to the chill of the desert night. Eva stood on the tarmac, a lone figure in the fading light. A sleek, unmarked jet, its paint scheme a non-reflective black, sat waiting for her, its engines whining with a quiet, powerful hum. It was her ride home, her chariot back to the world of shadows and secrets. The SEALs of Trident III stood a respectful distance away, watching her. They had been debriefed, their wounds tended to, their gear restowed. They were safe, they were alive, and they owed it all to the quiet, unassuming woman who was about to disappear from their lives as quickly as she had entered them. Thorne, their leader, felt a sense of profound and unsettling loss. He had known Eva for less than a day, and yet she had left an indelible mark on him, on all of them. She had shattered their preconceived notions, their professional arrogance, their very understanding of the world, and she had done it all with a quiet, unassuming grace that was both humbling and inspiring. He knew that he would never see her again. She was a ghost, a whisper in the static, and her world was not his. But he also knew that he would never forget her. She would be a part of his story, a part of their story, forever. As if sensing his thoughts, Eva turned and looked at them, her gaze sweeping over their faces. She gave them a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared experience, of the bond that had been forged in the crucible of combat. And then she turned and walked up the ramp of the jet, disappearing into its dark interior without a backward glance. The ramp hissed shut, and a moment later the jet began to taxi down the runway, its powerful engines leaving a trail of shimmering heat in the cool night air. The SEALs watched it go, their faces upturned to the sky. They watched as it climbed higher and higher, a dark, silent shape against the backdrop of the dying sun. And then, with a sudden, impossible burst of speed, it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. For a long time the SEALs stood there, staring at the empty sky, each one lost in his own thoughts. They had been to the edge of death and back, and they had been saved by a ghost. And as they turned and walked back towards the relative safety of their barracks, they knew that they were changed men. They had been given a glimpse behind the curtain, a look into a world of shadows and secrets, and they would never be the same. They were SEALs, the best of the best, but they had just learned that there was always someone better, and sometimes she was the quiet, unassuming woman who sat in the corner, the one you never saw coming, the one who took out the enemy commander with a single impossible shot, the one who was a ghost in the machine.